Hi, everyone. My name is Billy Joe Hardy, and I'm the Associate Director for Waakabanas. I'm going to stand in for the introduction because Etsy is otherwise trying to fix some of the IT and get that set up for everyone. So otherwise she would be here. I'm just going to give an introduction to our guest speaker today. And then if we could maybe have a round and everyone could introduce themselves, just a short introduction, your name maybe, and who you're here with. And it's my pleasure actually to welcome Dr. Joseph Gaughan to the Indigenizing Health Symposium today. Joseph Gaughan is the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American Program and an international expert in the psychology and mental health of American Indians and other Indigenous peoples. A professor at Harvard University, Dr. Gaughan has collaborated with tribal communities for 30 years to critique conventional mental health services and to harness traditional culture and spirituality for advancing Indigenous well-being. So I just would like to say that it's a real pleasure to have you and an honor to have you here today. And I think I taught a reading course about 2 years ago, and many of your readings made up part of the course. So I'm looking forward to the talk today, and maybe we can start. Oh, wherever you want to start. Maybe we can start on this one. Just have everyone give their name and a short introduction.
Okay, so I just got here. My name's Liam. I'm a new research assistant with Waakabanas. Been trying to put some wood on the fire today, and I hope everyone's having a nice morning.
Be glad. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is John Wabagijik. I'm with Waakabanas. I'm the administrative coordinator. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Dr. Gaughan. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
I'm Hugo. I'm also a new research assistant. Yeah, it's good to be here.
I'm Corey Davidson, and I work with the Indigenous Network in Mississauga, and I help with a food security program. And I just want to thank you for having me this morning.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tiara, also an RA at Waakabanas, but I'm also completing the Master's of Public Health and Indigenous Health. Very happy to be here. We also did some readings in one of the classes I'm taking right now, so that's why I'm here, excited for today.
Hi, my name's Benji. I'm a nurse with Toronto Public Health on a street outreach program, and yeah, happy to be here and learning today.
Hello, my name is Vic. I recently graduated from UMass Boston, studying the neuroscience of sex diversity that resists this heteropatriarchal normatives of neuroscience. Very glad to be here today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosita Razavi. I'm a senior research associate at the Toronto Department of Molecular Genetics. I'm an Iranian settler, and I am honored to be in this gathering.
Ani Bojo. My name is Michelle. I am a graduate student at York, and I saw this and I was like, I wanted to come because I missed the other event. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Georgina Fenchik. I do different consulting, but I'm going to be doing a little bit more for the Indigenous community. And thank you very much.
My name is Kaden, and I've wandered across the campus from Knoxville.
Hey everyone, I'm Gavin. I work with Waakabanas as a RA, a research assistant. But I'm actually a grade 11 student up in Newmarket doing a co-op and starting part-time in the summer. So yeah, happy to be here.
Rich. Hi everyone, my name is Shanti. I am a research officer and the Ontario NEAR coordinator at Waakabanas. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for everybody who's online. We've got quite a few folks, and thank you for your talk. I'm really looking forward to it. Miigwech.
Koi, my name is Sue. I'm a two-spirited transgender man. I'm an elder novice keeper for Waakabanas and for Two Spirits. Thank you for coming. I look forward to it. Thank you for your talk.
Mike Oaksey, research assistant at Waakabanas. I was working here before, to Montreal to start a doctorate. Still finishing that doctorate and, you know what I mean? And, yeah, I just, a lot of research on, First Nations ice hockey, social work educated from a metropolitan and, I have a great passion that's kind of emerging and something I grapple with, and it's just like this, concept of digital minimalism. My own narrative and not have a podcast in my ear all the time. But it's a battle. You know, I was in the bush for 5 days with some wonderful people here. I looked at my phone for like 30 minutes. These games a little bit here and there, but that's different. That's different than the YouTube program. Blah, blah, blah. My feels.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amina Mirza. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Wakimanas. And thank you, Dr. Gong, for being here. It's nice to see everybody. And so I introduced myself already, but really great to hear about Betty Dupan.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you about the paper. My name is Dr. Michaela Gabriel. This name is Laughing Swan. I'm Italian and make from Toronto, which is now known as Newfoundland. I'm a psychologist, a research scientist at Unity Health Toronto, a professor here at Wakimanas where I did my postdoc, and I've worked with Etsy for many beautiful years doing my clinical training. And I'm a scientist for mental health, mental health. Anyway, so it talks a lot about the different ways we have to support our patients and clients here in Toronto at Native Women's Resource Center.
Thanks, Dan. Very proud to be here.
All right, thank you, everyone, and I'd like to thank Clay for his welcoming and his opening today, and all of the helpers as well who are up there. So maybe I'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, it's great. Well, relatives, it's really good to gather with you, especially at this amazing space. And I'm grateful for the opening that you did and this getting us to the right place to move forward today. So my understanding is that this is the traditional territory of some Anishinaabe groups and some Haudenosaunee groups and Huron a little bit. So grateful to visit these lands, come from the States, of course, and haven't been here that many times in my career in my life. So it's good to be back. Have a chance to stay a little more and to get to know. It's very good to join you. We start with a bit of an introduction to myself and then talk a little bit about the topic that I want to learn for you today. First of all, can you hear me okay? I'm going to try to talk a little bit louder. Well, my name is Joseph Gaughan, and Gaughan is a family name that originated back in 1891. So my great-grandfather, who was the first Gaughan, went to Federal Indian Boarding School at Fort Belknap Agency in north central Montana on our reservation at the age of 5 years old. And according to my grandma, his oldest daughter, he never left, not one time, she said, during the next decade of his educational experiences. During that time, he was brutalized in all kinds of ways that he didn't talk much about, but emerged from there with many relatives gone, including his own mother. I would tell him that she was dead. And so we, of course, share the legacies and burdens of that particular expression of colonial subjugation. We have you here in Canada as well. At that time in the Federal Indian Boarding School system, when you arrived as a young Indian kid, speaking only your language and having your name in your own language, the goal, of course, was to erase and replace with a different identity. And at that time, the custom was the Indian agents and the superintendents and the school people would basically take your father's Indian name in translation, give that to you as a surname, and then create a Christian name for it. So his father or stepfather's Indian name was Gaughan for war. So they just put that to Gaughan. Gave him the Christian name Freddie, so he became Freddie Gaughan, and it's the first Gaughan. So pretty large family now. My dad is the late Joe Azure. Heralds from the Azure lines and the Briscoe lines at Fort Belknap. My mom comes from the Gaughan and the Crazy family lines. As you can hear, I carry her surname. And I would say it's a good thing she didn't hyphenate her family names, or I'd be a psychologist named Dr. Gaughan Crazy. get away patients in. I am born and reared in Montana, not on the reservation, different cities throughout the state. Uh, Really went back after college, we lived at work while I was deciding what to do for graduate school. Had stumbled upon for 5 years in 3 different colleges in the stint in the US Army overseas. But I wanted to become a psychologist, so went ahead for graduate school at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign to undertake doctoral work in clinical communities. So that's what I've done ever since, with an eye for figuring out how do we make relevant and apply what psychology has to offer, both in terms of its knowledge base, but in terms of its applications for people who are suffering their own disease. And I realized early on in my career that probably the way I wanted to contribute was not so much therapy and counseling, as there are lots of limitations, at least in the United States healthcare system, for innovating circumstances. So that's why I became an academic. It never occurred to me to become an academic until learning to realize those truths. So I've been an academic now for 25 years, an academic, as I say, and done my best to harness Indigenous knowledge, traditional practices and perspectives, and to find a way to contribute that to the broader field of psychology and mental health. And so what I want to share with you today is a bit about what I've learned over the course of various research projects during the past 30 years, I guess, that speak to issues of traditional healing. And so let me proceed toward that. Gather you probably know something about American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, or Native Americans in the United States a bit, but just so you're clear, we are obviously the living descendants of indigenous peoples that have been in those lands since time immemorial. We're characterized by terrific cultural diversity in American peoples, one gamut, much like they did in Canada, so you're already aware of these issues. We've experienced an incredible demographic rebound at the time of the arrival of Columbus to the hemisphere. People estimate sometimes 5 million to 10 million to 12 million, and numbers go up from there, but in what is now the continent of the United States. But that really bottomed out after a few centuries. By the 1890s, there were only 240,000 people, indigenous identified people living in the United States. So that was really a low point. My own tribal community, Ani, Rowan, so forth on that, we declined really to about 500, not quite 600 people. But of course, in the ensuing century and more, we come to much more numerous. Today, there are some almost 6 million citizens of the United States, people in the United States, according to the latest US Census, that identify as American Indian or Alaska Native alone. If you allow a combination of that with some other race, it climbs almost to 10 million. And we're organized in over 570 federally recognized tribal nations. Those don't always accord with ethnicity as such, and lots of Sioux tribes, Chippewa or Ojibwe tribes. Anyway, but in terms of the sovereign status, nations, quite a few of us. Really, by virtue of that status as sovereign nations, the context for American Health Services is quite unique, quite specific. In some ways, your healthcare system here is similarly specific. In our case, we obviously have persistent health inequities of various kinds. In the mental health domain, that tends to run to what we refer to as addiction, trauma, suicide, in particular. That's the kinds of problems we're grappling with. These are, originating out of the context of colonial subjugation, the ensuing poverty and discrimination that our peoples have faced for a very long time and continue to contend with. All of this has given rise to a really distinctive healthcare services knowledge. So there really is federal health service, which counts for delivering health services or at least funding health services for private nations. And it makes gold from straw essentially. It's never funded to be required to really try to meet the health needs of our people. But it's able to do kind of amazing things with its shoestring budget. In this context, there are long-standing tribal commitments to cultural reclamation and revitalization. Some communities are very fortunate to have large populations, are able to preserve and retain a good deal of traditional practices, ceremonies. Communities, smaller communities especially, or depending on the specifics and when they were encountered with Europeans and what kinds of subjugation tended to maybe have lost them. So there's ways in which reclamation revitalization becomes really, really common. And all of that is in service to a broader community commitment to self-determination. It's a phrase that we use a lot because of a certain law in 1975 in some Formation Act, which was really important for how federal nations operate. Well, that's just brief background. If you want to know more about some of that context, we can discuss exchange momentarily. But now I want to introduce you a little bit to American traditional healing. To provide some background about before we talking a few specifics. What is American Indian traditional healing? Well, these are indigenous therapeutic logics and practices that have some continuity with a long period of refining, practicing, honoring, and valuing. And what's interesting about this is despite a long period of colonial subjugation in which many of these practices were outlawed, practitioners were jailed by the Indian agent, it's basically like a dictator, most of our reservations. And yet some of these remarkably advanced laws persist in terms of practice. Thank you. Now, the thing that we need to attend to, of course, is in the process of, in many instances, revitalizing these practice conditions. There's been changes to them. So they're not locked in time. There's not like pristine things from hundreds of years ago that look no different. They've been updated and adapted in all kinds of ways. So tending to the fact that they've been refashioned for contemporary purposes is to acknowledge that all human beings adapt to new circumstances. That adaptation in cultural terms or any other terms is to be understood and recognized. And of course, in the modern world, these intersect pretty extensively with non-indigenous therapeutic practices of all kinds, whether it's all kinds of practices like counseling or meditation or broader biomedical services to cancer treatment. That just includes that. One question, if we're at all interested in appreciating these indigenous traditional practices around healing, is how can we, in the context of scholarship, study, in the university environment, come to learn about tradition. And I want to suggest to you there's a bit of a paradox I have to grapple with that. And that paradox comes from the fact that on the one hand, traditional healing routinely entails esoteric knowledge that's secret, that's in need of maybe protection, that these practitioners sometimes are gifted with special kinds of powers, abilities, through spirit patrons of various kinds, who as part of that arrangement are not supposed to talk about or communicate with the Rapti why, outside of very special circumstances. So on the one hand, we're dealing with, in most instances, sacred power, holy power. I think in the modern age, we sometimes talk about that as energy, differently talk about the old word is power. Most of our languages have words for power. And sacred power or holy power, obviously, is what brings help along with it. It's also dangerous. We don't know what you're doing. Colonial resistance is another reason for secrecy, because obviously if these are being told and forced to give up a lot of these traditions and practices, then finding ways to protect it, preserve it, meant being quiet about it. And there are those relational obligations I talked about, except for under very specific circumstances, that you the spirit who's gifted you with some of these approaches and practices and understands it not to share. You remember the work of Black Belt, the Lakota, who famously features in 30s book Blackout Speaks, shared an amazing vision he had. He was a fun cat. And even as he was telling it to the white locator who was writing it all down, said, I feel like my power is leaving me because I'm telling you all. So it's a kind of arrangement of this. So that's, traditional knowledge about healing therapeutic. Interestingly, though, paradoxically, scholarly inquiry requires a really different set of assumptions and orientations. Details what I call analytic knowledge. It's very rational, cerebral, dissecting, and the concepts of those are often a secular pursuit. It's not really necessarily cognizant of or wedded to particular spiritual understandings or assumptions. Obviously, the context of the United States and Canada, you're grappling with an imperial gaze. Inquirers who, certain politics and theology is associated with their inquiry, and trades in conceptual abstractions. So a very different form of knowing than what we have traditionally. And that leads to a bit of a paradox. How do we learn about this stuff? What are the ways we approach and understand, discuss, inquire? So I wanted today just to offer potential gestures toward a scholarly resolution of these particular tensions and maybe contradictions. But I want to first say that today I'll share only what I've learned from participants in research projects that who have allowed me to share, because they talked about that in the context of inquiry, or what I've gleaned from public records and accounts. This is where we can get that access to that in some ways, as analyzed and interpreted by me. So this isn't necessarily what you would make of it, or what other Native people would make of it. I'd say things different. It's obviously it's my take, my perspective. This particular approach. And this has come to me not because I've undertaken many projects that were designed to understand traditional people. Actually, it's come up with some other kinds of work that I've done in terms of scholarly projects over the course of my career, where that's the kind of thing that I end up sharing about. So it's in many instances incidental. One of my very first research projects as a graduate student in the 1990s was with my own elders and elders on the Fort Belknap Reservation, because I was interested in understanding how they made sense of Army identity. So I engaged in interviewing numbers of them, and they had a lot to say about contemporary Army identity in ways that were sometimes continuous, but often discontinuous with the past and with tradition. And so sometimes they talked about traditional practices like healing or doctoring practices. So go into a little bit more. My first sort of standalone research project after I had completed all my coursework and so on was exploring culture and mental health at Fort Belknap. So I went home, and the goal was to sort of hold at bay, to bracket all of the training I've received, all of the professional expertise I obtained in clinical psychology, to instead inquire an open-ended and discovery-oriented fashion. Help people make sense of the relationship between problem drinking and clinical depression and culture, spirituality, and learn about the therapeutic traditional standpoint in those inquiries as well. I did a project here at Nelson House in Manitoba some years back now with the First Nations Healing Lodge, and that called the Nelson House Medicine. And there I was interested in understanding how they practiced and managed their healing in the context of addiction treatment. That's what it is, an accredited addiction treatment program. So I spent 7 weeks on site doing kind of participant observation to be able to articulate how healing practice and we're still there. I'm also in the process of publishing a body of works written by my great-grandfather, Fred Bach, that I told you about, who in 1941-42 was hired as what was called the Montana Writers Month. This was a project that was funded by the Federal Works Progress Administration before World War II broke out, in which folklorists from around the state were engaged in part of it was an employment program, of course. There was Great Depression, there was a lot of suffering and financial engagement. So this project was one which they also decided in the Montana Writers Project to make sure there were some Native people engaged. And so Fred Vaughn was the Ahani field worker on our reservation, who went around and talked to all of our elders at that time and tried to record what they remembered from the reservation, pre-reservation phase, what they had to share with the broader community. And he wrote over 700 pages, longhand script, various accounts, biographies, true tales or war stories, myths, and probably his magnum opus is a history of our most famous medicine in the 19th century, Bull Lodge, from back in the Lodge. Also engaged with the Blackfoot Nation in northwestern Montana to develop with original people there approach to addiction that would be premised on Blackfeet therapeutic tradition more so than on like Alcoholics Anonymous or projects that people health. So together we developed the Blackfeet Culture Camp as a Blackfeet driven approach to addiction treatment that entailed addiction treatment clients coming out to bush, living in teepees, practicing ceremonies, harvesting medicines and so on off the land in a way that was understood or therapeutically beneficial for us for Blackfeet addiction treatment clients that the usual residential group-based psychoeducation. Talk about your feelings. Not long thereafter, I hosted at the University of Michigan a gathering of Native American healers in the effort to put in dialogue with a lot of traditional practitioners from different communities and folks from the south, west, and north. I'll share some of their thoughts, perspectives, and this is a subject hearing in dialogue with mental health researchers and counselors and therapists. So the idea was to have a dialogue together and sort of what the relevance is and understand it, and just begin to have that conversation. Finally, I partnered with Urban Indian Health Clinic in Detroit, who asked that we help them figure out how to include traditional healing practices into the healthcare services they offer. So in a multi-year project that went through various phases, we went ahead and interviewed a lot of providers there, a lot of administrators, service delivery people, but also focus groups and community members to try to find out more what they consider of interest around traditional healing practices. And of course, consulting with traditional healers that folks identify as people who can provide the kind of perspective and expertise that is necessary to develop a model for integrating. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. So, this could be this background, a little bit about the projects, of course, but to tell you that specific examples of traditional healing that I'll proceed to next arise from my projects and collaborations over these many years. They illustrate healing across time, place, and circumstance. They illuminate distinctive healing logics and practices. They reveal both continuity and adaptation in healing. And I really just want to give you some more examples that I've heard of various projects that helps to think about traditional healing yesterday, today, and tonight. So let me start by moving now into dynamic healing traditions. Again, I want to give you some good examples. So I told you my great grandfather did Almani field worker on the reservation in 1941-42, collected and preserving traditional knowledge from our elders at that time. He wrote a lot about it. His most important contribution was an account he called Bull Lodge's Life. It's a biography of a 19th century Mexican person in our community called Bull Lodge. He got this account from Bull Lodge's surviving daughter, who at that time was about 82 years old. Bull Lodge's daughter, Garter Snake, or Snake Woman, was someone who knew her father's life and times intimately. He had shared this information with her, and she said when grandfather came at their door, "Oh, I always wondered why he trusted me with all of this information, because no one's cared enough to even ask me about it until you." And so she gave him Bull Lodge's biography. That's what he wrote down. So Bull Lodge was born roughly 1802. He died in 1886. And he was someone who, as a young man, had encounters with spirit patrons that shaped his life. At the age of 12, for example, he was out on the prairie. And I should say first that Bull Lodge was sort of half an orphan. His father was a white man. At that time, since white men didn't live in our community, that meant he didn't have family ties in the way that was typical or normative. And so he was kind of poor and desperate. And as a little boy, he would go around to where people had set their sacred pipes. We as a community were responsible for 2 sacred pipes that involved community-wide ceremonies. And these would be hung in a bundle in a tripod outside the priest's keeper's lodge. And so when the camp would move, he would go to where the tripod had sat. He would pray and beg and cry and plead that someone above would help. This was his happening. because he was not well off. Well, again, the first instance of this bringing fruit was he was 12 years old. He was out on the prairie and was laying on his back looking into the sky and had a vision in which he saw descending from above a round portrait that really was a sacred shield for purposes of fighting in war. Shields, of course, are round and made out of buffalo pump, dried in certain ways, and usually is painted. So he saw the painting of the thunderbird, the thunder be on the sheep ascended, and a voice told him, "I'm giving this to you. This will protect you later in life. Remember it, and I'll tell you if it's time to get it." It's 12 years old.
Wow.
What he then did was over the course of later, we would today say adolescence, and that can't put a lot of sense back then. He was instructed by patrons above again to fast and pray on 7 different weeks. The tradition and territory of our leader at that time, which was not second. The first youth he went up and fasted and prayed for 7 days and 7 nights. And had a visit in which the youth being invited him in and offered him a gift. Power was very good. The kind of powers he got during these sequential visions of fast or war power, doctrine power, so on. And so he then went to a different youth. He was instructed and fasted for 6 days. Next youth for 5 days. Now, so 1 day at night. And in each of these 7 encounters, he received gifts of knowledge, ceremonial practices, powers to live a life, and was told to sit on these things until we tell you. So he did. At the age of 30, he was told it's time to go to war. Got to accomplish yourself in war. By way of background, our people, always small in numbers, were really sandwiched between a big set of alliances between the Cree and the Assiniboine to our east, Blackfoot Confederacy to our west. We were part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, but we were the ones who were right in between these warring factions, which would be stabilized primarily by fur trade, because there was great competition for access to the trade goods. So what this meant is in our entire history, from when white men started to step down upon us in the 1700s, the Northern Plains was a cauldron of violence. And so war became the way to survive obviously, and society really developed, adapting, privileging privileges. So this is why Bull Lodge didn't go to war before he did. So he made the shield, went to war, and he became a combat warrior. The way to do that is you lead war parties at some point, in which success is had against the enemy, don't lose, was able to do that. Then later, at the age of 40, his uncle Yellow became stricken, some illness, of which he was declining very fast. And Bull Lodge, of course, had received doctor from these mute beings as well. So at that time, announced himself as a doctor and began his very first treatment with his uncle. And the doctrine power he received entailed use of ritual implements. He had a bowl, he had a black cloth he would use, and an eagle bone whistle. So there were certain ways he was told to doctor, the usual protocols which were familiar. And so what I want to do is just provide you with an excerpt, a brief excerpt, from my great grandfather's writing of his biography. You can get an idea of how full was about his biography. There's a window of insight into healing from quite a while ago. So again, he's doctoring his uncle Yellowman. Yellowman is barely conscious, lying on his back and not able to do much. He's got his ritual implements. He's already called together singers, etc. Here he is. Bull Lodge took with him his drum and medicines and the black cloth that he's going to use in his doctoring. He entered the teepee where the sick man was. Approaching the sick man going to his left, he sat down on the ground about even with the foot of the sick man's bed, took his drum, said to them, that's the men and the women who are there to sing for him, "I'll sing my song 3 times for you, then I'll turn the drum and sing it over to you." Bull Lodge then stripped off his clothes, all but his breechcloth, took red paint, which is commonly used by the Indian, and painted all the scars that were on his body that had been made by him during the time of his fasting experiences and different places. And we would go try for a vision, cut yourself to sacrifice because you're trying to get attention from very distant. Sacrifice of jointings. So he painted all of those scars. The scars were on his arms and legs and lower chest. He also painted his forehead and wrists red too. Then, taking the drum, he sang a song, keeping time with the drum, sang the song 4 times. And he turned the drum and singing over to those 7 men and women who were there to sing for him. Bulage then took the wooden bowl, which he brought along to use, and placed it beside his patient. This bowl was about 6 inches or more in diameter from rim to rim, about 2 or 3 inches deep, and the center of its hollow was painted with the imitation of a rainbow. On the edge of its rim, the inside was all black, and the outside dark red. But the rainbow aspect to it because his relationship was really with hunger. The patient had been covered with a black cloth, and when Bulage turned his attention to the patient, took the black cloth off the patient, and using his mouth, Bulage began to draw on the patient's chest. Sucking. This is the old-time sucking doctor. Know about it. He did this 4 times, and after each time Bulage spit the stuff he drew out of the patient's chest into the wound. After repeating the drawing 4 times, he then had the patient turn over so his back was exposed. Then Bulage began drawing on the patient's back with his mouth. Repeating this 4 times, the singing stopped. The stuff he had drawn out of the patient's chest and back was a mixture of yellow, green, and brownish colors. Skipping a bit, Bulage then ordered the singers to sing again. He then covered the patient with the black cloth, and lifting the pipe filled with pinnick, he smoked. During the process of smoking, every so often Bulage would blow smoke on the cloth, but covered the patient until he had blown out 4 times. Then the singers were done singing. Bulage then gathered the black cloth, covering the patient with both hands. Standing up, he held the cloth up and spoke, saying, "My Father, above man, these powers to heal and cure with, I appreciate. Look down on me, I raise a body up." Skipping a bit more, Bulage then made incense, after which Bulage took the black cloth by one corner with his left hand, and with his right hand held the bowl of cloth and passed it over the smoke of incense 4 times, after which he covered the wooden bowl that contained the stuff he had drawn from the patient's chest and back. After covering the bowl with the black cloth, Bulage lit the pipe filled with pinnick and smoked. He blew the smoke on the covered bowl, and after doing this 4 times, he stood up. Taking the bowl, still covered with the black cloth, he held it up with a gesture of offering. He said a short prayer. "My Father, above man, this life you gave me, the power to heal and cure, I appreciate. Look down on me, I raise a body up again." Then putting the bowl down, he covered it, and it was empty. The stuff the bowl contained had disappeared mysteriously. The above-mentioned wooden bowl was made by Bulage out of a knobby growth on a box elder tree. He made it purposely for his own doctor. So this account of his Dr. Delaman, which this was just an initial, but there's pages and pages because it was multiple sessions over the course of months. But Dr. Delaman did fully recover, despite the fact that he looked very desperate. And after this, he went on to doctor many other people until there was a total of, I think, 19, which is 7 plus 12. There was a lot of numbers associated with the sacred activities. But you get the idea here of the ceremonial ritual aspects to it and of the power at work, the sucking of substance, the spitting it in a bowl, the transformation, in this case, the spirits. But there's also an instance later on when he was doctoring his uncle where the stuff in the bowl transformed into like little marble. Didn't know what to call it, but it was like marble-like of different colors, substances. And of course, he's calling on his spirit patrons. Above man come at some point, he calls them in. They are the ones who bring the power. Okay, so that's like old time doctoring, at least as we have reported from my great grandfather talking to Bulage's daughter and preserving this stuff. I want to give you another example that's a little more contemporary. And that more contemporary has to do with a story that I've heard from my grandmother, the late Bertha Vaughn Stuff. My grandma Bertha, I say, taught me everything I know about what it means to be all Ani. And a lot what she share with me were things that were about the change she experienced in her own life. She was born in 1918, you know, of course, lived to be about 97 years old. Passed away here about a decade ago at this point. But during the first project I told you about was interviewing on elders about on cultural identity. I had a chance to interview her. So that was one of my first interviews that were formal for that project. In that interview, she offered eyewitness account of a doctoring example from her own father, Greg Vaughn. This occurred during the early reservation era. So that bill and consented. And it featured an Ahani doctor named Stiff Arm. And in Stiff Arm's doctoring of this woman who was sick, he engaged with what he had was pelt. Ferret. So here, this pelt came to life through his doctor. Here's what she said. Quote, they called Stiff Arm to come and doctor this woman. Certain songs they sing 4 times, they sing, call this medicine to get it going. My dad was there, he was singing. Here, my dad said, Stiff Arm had a ferret pelt. Put it over by the door, and this woman was laying over here. Stiff Arm would back away from that pelt while blowing a bone whistle, just like he was coaxing with that whistle. With blowing it, he back up towards that woman. Pretty soon, this thing moved. From this way, Stiff Arm would come after again, he blows whistle, go that way. About the 4th time he did that, that ferret just lit right in there, just buried his head in this woman's stomach. Stiff Arm pulled something out. It was like a tumor, about that big around. He showed it to us, put it in our hands. Meantime, Stiff Arm had to make a fire. Dad said it looked like a tumor with veins all over it. He said, felt like a piece of liver, but it had a membrane over it, like a gland. He showed it to us. He put it in my hand. It was blood. Then here, this ferret was laying alongside of it. It was a hide again, just a dry hide. But they'd seen it attack her and go into her body. So they took that tumor and put it in that fire and burn up. That's what you call medicine. Grandma's story here in part about this particular incident that her father had shared with her was about, there used to be power like that, but we don't have power like that anymore. And even though younger people are saying they have power like that, I'm skeptical. What's her point? She was mentioning particularly that kind of this conflict and the ability to work with sacred power, which she did not doubt one iota was real, but what she definitely felt had probably passed and was no longer able to work. One thing I'll point out, just because it's concerning the health services, has to do with the nature of evidence. So, she's talking about evidence. Her father was talking about evidence here. I held it in my hand. We each got to touch it. It was a tumor and describe the tumor. That's instance of evidence. And one other thing I'll say that's going on, I think, in this sort of also evidentiary is a hat tip or a recognition of Indigenous knowledge traditions. There probably is no higher authority than first-hand personal experience. I experienced it, happened to me. That's the best I can convey to you. So do with it what you will. In this instance, it's her father saying this first-hand experience, and she's telling me, and anyone else should have told. She's using quoted speech. He said, and then what he said, using words like I. So I would just suggest to you that rhetoric, narratively, there's kind of a fusion of experiences and perspectives going on through the way even quoted speech is used. There's no great practice. So far, everybody.
So 10 minutes max.
Oh, really? Okay, great.
Time flies when you have.
Sure does. Great, so I'll turn to one last example then, which has to do with the urban Indian historic traditional healing project that we talked about that they helped in Detroit. And this was a partnership with Detroit's Urban Indian Health Clinic with a goal of integrating traditional healing into behavioral health services. And so we undertook a multi-phase consultation for it. And part of that, as I said, was interviewing healers. Interviewing peak healers to just understand better how would they imagine being able to integrate the work that they do into the services itself. What would be the ins and outs, whys and the wherefores, how would you pick? Among the healers, there were 5 women, 7 were from the Midwest, and each from North Plains. And basically asked, open-ended questions like what kinds of traditional healing activities are most suitable for integration. What behavioral outcomes might you expect from patients who participate, etc. So really open-ended, just trying to get a sense from what they would recommend. What are those? Transcribe those. And what was interesting, I think, was that there was a striking diversity, even among the healers that had been identified by leaders of the clinic for consultation. They exhibited markedly different outlooks, practices, recommendations. I'll just give you 4 really brief illustrations so you can appreciate some of that diversity. One healer described his healing practice with routine references to ceremonies and natural medicines or herbal agents. Didn't describe these in any detail, however. In fact, it was common for the healers we interviewed to be a little bit reticent, not talk so much about in detail what they were up to. Again, not at all unexpected because these kind of practices are often secret, meant to be kept undisclosed. So just logging that here, your scoring does make it a little bit difficult to be able to talk and understand and articulate and translate these experiences when the knowledge itself is missing. Second example, another healer had a relatively well-formulated proposal to train clinic staff on how to provide acupuncture of the ear, which is based in traditional Chinese medicine, of course, for clients with substance problems. She thought her role, her contribution to what's going on in the clinic would be to train everybody up and how to do this acupuncture. Ways that could assist clients. So that was her contribution that she thought they should do. A third example was a healer identifying herself as a seer, sometimes as a psychic, who would scatter tobacco during client consultations, receive communications from the tobacco that enable her to formulate what was going on for the client to recommend, and so on. She already saw native clients throughout clinics in Canada here and throughout that part of Detroit and that part of the country on a consultation basis. You know, it's just like a doctor, 50-minute session, come in, just scatter tobacco. And the final example was another healer who was like deeply skeptical that traditional practices could in fact be integrated into the urban community setting at all. His recommendation was that urban people need to come out to the bush. You can't do this in an urban environment. They should come out to the bush. And of course, the problem is that a lot of the folks in the city were low income, there's not good public transportation. They have no way to get out to the bush, which is exactly why when just trying to put it in. But this person felt convinced you can't. So these are just 4 out of the 7 healers that we talked to, whose views and visions, perspectives are really quite different. So I think the lessons from this were that the diversity of outlooks, approaches, and practices need to really sober the challenge. You sort through these kind of efforts and how you might into services ways. And ultimately, from this entire project, no consensual program or structure emerged for how to do this exactly. Really, there were lots of trade-offs. Like, you know, you could bring in 1 or 2 healers in and give people a chance to get to know them. There's trust and figuring out like confidence in the healer's abilities takes time, but all that to happen. On the other hand, that restricts to particular traditions in our urban areas. We have lots and lots of people from lots of communities, so we don't have the diversity. So that's a trade-off. There were other trade-offs too. Let me start to wind down here then with a few concluding ideas. Probably the thing that's most important to wrap up there is the recognition. Obviously, we're talking about diversity across time, diversity across communities, diversity in reservation versus urban settings. These are often entail sacred and mystical kinds of endeavors. They're really distinct from the logics of biomedicine. That's other term that's really clear, which engages that kind of mechanistic materialist approach to these sorts of things. And so, even as they're relevant for healthcare today, they do require orientation, probably translation, or segregation. Something. There's a lot to be managed. But what I want to close with is to say that in all of my work in behavioral health with Native communities over my career, I've come to recognize what I've termed an alternative science. Alternative, yeah, science, that's ESY science, which means it has to do with the Psy disciplines. Psy disciplines, what are those? Well, that's psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, psychology, Psy disciplines. Psy disciplines make knowledge. They have expertise. They tell us how we should intervene, how we should respond, what's good for us. And a lot of that effort is designed using SCI science to try to get empirically supported approaches and treatments and interventions, trying to ground its activity on what we know empirically, but a rigorous systematic study. The truth is, you can never do enough studies to bolster everything that you have to do when you're trying to be therapeutic beneficially. And so my point is that there's a lot of knowledge in the Psy disciplines that goes well beyond well beyond the empirical science for support. There's lore, there's hand-me-down knowledge and understanding, just things that are actually culturally organized, often not from indigenous. So this alternative science is a way of articulating how Native people in our communities think about behavioral health. And that there's lots of domains in the behavioral health professions that we can compare and contrast between psychiatric approach to these things versus this alternative science. Let's take the issue of disorder. DSM has 300 mental disorders codified and classified. Most of our communities only have. These are impact. All that historical trauma in the United States, this is the way that it's with language. That's a very different frame. It talks about stress, dysfunction, disability in the context of history, context of colonial subjugation, etc. So it's a whole way that's an alternative to the DSM, that kind of approach. When it comes to well-being and what it means to thrive, or survive, it's not middle class Euro-American norms, neoliberal individualism, free agents navigating free markets in pursuit of autonomy and wealth. And it's more relational forms of self. Want to say half about that. Look like use what's an alternative. When it comes to intervention, it's not the latest, greatest empirically supported treatments, the therapy that's been studied through randomized controlled trials, but rather revitalized and reclaimed forms of traditional healing. When it comes to evaluation, how do you know what works? It's not scientific outcome studies. It's indigenous traditional knowledge of various forms. Again, which tend to prioritize first-hand personal experience much more than second-party distant, abstruse scientific. So those are just 4 domains in this alternative science in which everywhere I've gone in the country, find out people talking about this endeavor in ways that compare, mostly contrast with what's going on in sciences like. Maybe I'll stop there and invite however you would like to do it. Thank you.
Merci Cho, thank you so much, Dr. Gong, for sharing your research and your story with us. It's very exciting to hear this. Some of us have waited for many, many years to hear you speak to us in person, so we're very grateful that you came. I'd like to invite anyone in the circle, both the in-person circle and the virtual circle, to pose any questions or make any comments. We have time set aside for that, for this discussion aspect, which can be very powerful.
As like my study, I'm working with like my community, and I grew up the street from here. And I'm just curious about the whole thing of there's no separation between my life and my study, and it's been a wonderful journey, but it's got its challenges too, as kind of internalized outsiderness. And I just wanted to ask about how you've found that and navigated those kinds of if there's any inside or outsider. It's beautiful for me, but it's challenging.
Yeah. I think Native academics who study Native issues all grapple with inside and outside issues, because we're talking about knowledge production in academic terms, which is not how to think about it. Engage in knowledge reproduction communities, and part of it has to do with is a need to engage in rational fashion with ideas and important ideas, and engage in couple of disciplines and fields of knowledge that have already come to some conclusions about some things that maybe you have settled in some important ways. So we all have to make decisions. How much are we interested in that endeavor? Engaging with knowledge in our existing disciplines or fields, versus how much are we really interested in preserving on behalf of community members and for our own communities, facilitating and supporting local efforts to apply that knowledge in ways that make it more widely available to members of the community. I think we can do all of those things, but probably we're more comfortable, interested, versatile. Some more than others. So I think that's a big part of what it means. If you're going to be an academic, of course, in a university setting, you do have to learn how to sing for yourself in those terms, or you're not going to be there very long. So there is that. And of course, you navigate all that in ways that allow you to remain legible at home. You know, and I think that requires that kind of multicultural, bicultural, at least about cultural things of fluidity and flexibility to reach different audiences those ways. And that's an extra obligation that goes on us who are rigid inside or outside to that. Also think that insider outsider can be uncomfortable. I mean, I think most native academics are, are unusual people, you're totally comfortable just living and doing that. You wouldn't necessarily come to be an academic. But there's something that stands out about how you think that you're interested in that usually people in the world of academia, because academia is not really familiar to anybody except for maybe the kids at professors. And so it entails certain kinds of departures, excursions, taking up approaches, ways of thinking, and it can be all good. It's just that I think it does require navigation.
Mine is more of a comment and maybe segue to a question, but coming from science background and listening to your talk, I just imagine this like the natural way that entropy and enthalpy works. One creates structure and reduction, and the other one wants to just expand and allow all the possibilities. And just to hear these different perspectives on how they come together, just being part of the natural world that would create a process, not necessarily finding the solution or figuring out what's better or what's not. I'm just curious how you see this as a process itself. And if it is some sort of, there is a goal.
Well, I do think that it's all tailored artists to what we're trying to accomplish. My great grandfather, for example, had accounted for Bull Lodge's life and the different doctrine processes he gives as one element of it. And was simply trying to observe stuff that was going to be forgotten if Snake would have died, and that story wasn't told, it probably not big down. Because for generations of people were not that interested. Became very interested in them starting in the 1970s. The paladin and so on in the States for looking back. So I think it's harnessed to what you're trying to accomplish, and that's one example of what we're trying to accomplish. But I think some of us also would like to see the opportunity for our people to benefit from therapeutic traditions that can help, particularly with problems like addiction, trauma, and suicide, ways that can be very potent and very confirming. But they don't have access to it right now. Services, so figure out how to facilitate that happens. But I do think that there are things to grapple with around science. In psychology, the field that most people we do engage in a lot of reductionism, a lot of objectification. I would suggest you all scholarly knowledge for all objectification. I think there's any way around it. The question becomes how do you contextualize that objectification? Taking something, taking it as an object and dissecting it, probably for analytic purposes. Writing about it, literacy, which should be certain amount of medical journal publication. But that is a particular mentality and a particular set of skills. And so what is it that we don't say? But obviously, these indigenous knowledge, we think a lot more about holism, reductions, about assembling things into finding connections and relations between things in a much more complicated fashion, rather than trying to dissect, reduce, control, understand, the thing. Just really different modalities of reasoning. So I think we want to find ways to alongside science. Champion both relation, integration, complexity. Even in our academic writing, so colleagues and other scholars can start to glimpse what they're looking at this stuff. So,
I know we met briefly yesterday. My name's Upstegan, incoming PhD student under Dr. Stewart Heskey. I just came in towards the tail end of your lecture, and I heard you talking about framework for thinking about medicine. And I also heard you talk about Sundance too, and some of the rituals associated with that. Like I've worked in few different sectors, and some of the language you were using reminded me of some of the work that we were doing at the Mukayam Clinic. It's a clinic out of Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. Reminded me of that because everybody in that clinic had a different skill set. Actually, that's where I first met Etsy about 10 years ago. And another thing that struck me too is that, you know, even academics, a lot of academics still practice, right? And like I practice at CAMH right now. Etsy has also been practicing at CAMH. So we're not pure academics, we're discipline people, you know. So in addition to our, you know, our academic practice, we're still practicing and working with community. And one of the challenges I find is that, especially in an urban center, there's still, and this is a legacy of having outlawed cultural practices for so long, there's still so much animosity and I'll just say like almost like a distaste for our cultural practices amongst Westerners. And I'm wondering how you, because I'm sure you must have experience with this, how do you grapple with that? How do you promote these healing practices in these urban settings, and what experience do you have with that?
yeah. You know, my approach is one of partnership and collaboration with programs and people who are doing this work. And so I do not presume that I can enter a setting and tell people what I can do. You know, it's not what I know from there. I don't do that. And so what I really do is try to facilitate, support efforts to step back from it all long enough to think some of these things through. The challenge is that in a workaday clinic, especially if it's on a reservation or a reserve, you know, there's so much that you've got to attend to. There's no time to step back and sort it all out, think it through, figure out how to make it. You know, so making time for people to have that engagement, and you know, they'll come up with their own solutions that make sense locally and the things that are important. So that's technically my approach. And in doing that, you can start to see how people do that. The Black Heat Culture Camp is an example, and I've written that up, so take a look at that if you want to see more about how that particular community chose to think about Black Heat therapy traditions' relevance for the addiction. The Urban American Nutritional Spirituality Program in Detroit, written that up. So, you know, and so I think also writing this stuff up in a way that allows the field, practitioners in the field, researchers in the field, policymakers in the field, to access that some of these local driven solutions look like. It's really important. And but again, I think the answers are local. They're probably going to arise from people living in a really know a setting, community, clientele, who think through and come up with what makes the most sense. And so there's not one size fits all. And I certainly don't know the answers for those settings. Only those people will know.
Sounds like recording and you know, keeping records is really important. Yeah,
I like that idea. And when it comes to things like healing or even just therapeutic outcomes, you know, keeping track kind of matters. And you know, I don't mean doing an RCT. I mean, that's expensive and complicated. You don't have to be that complex. Like just keeping track somehow, even with traditional healing stuff. Checking in 6 months later. How's it going? You know, just try and maybe taking a few notes back, because we all need feedback. Whether the efforts we're doing are therapeutically beneficial in the long haul or not. I mean, so here's an example, right? Is the late Jerry Mohat, community psychologist, was a white man who was going to become a Jesuit priest on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. You know, realized in talking with people in Rosebud and getting to know medicine people there that a Jesuit priest wasn't for his calling. He became a psychologist. But one thing they did is he reports in a case example a woman grappling with a psychotic illness in the community, you know, was put in a sweat lodge. They're trying to help her. And it totally blew her out. She decompensated dramatically in the context of the sweat lodge. So that's helpful to know, right? That maybe we can't assume that every particular conceivable approach that we would think that they necessarily have a direct consequential outcomes. Depends, and sorting out how it depends from how it doesn't depend requires keeping track. And then it would also require sharing. So this is the thing, as I also think that's really important. When appropriate, you know, some things aren't appropriate for sharing, as I talked about today. But others are okay to share, and I think we need not. So we can all have things that learn and offer the best thing. Give people or something, you know.
Hi. I just wanted to say, thank you so much for sharing on, like the sacredness of secret knowledge and traditional practices of how it's important for us to keep those private and keep those for ourselves. My research is, in education, Indigenous education, in regards to like, sweat lodge and making space for that, for people to access that. And, I did a beadwork. I have my beadwork here. It's visual representation of my research. And I really like how you talked about past, present, and future because it's represented here. It's really nice. If you want to see it, I could show it to you. Yeah, okay. Just listening to your talk, it really empowered me and inspired me. So, and it's about like the changing of water in the sweat lodge and how that can heal us in our DNA and our releasing. It's not done yet, but.
Can you put it that way so everyone can see it?
And folks online can see it too.
Yeah.
Transformation.
Yeah, transformation, healing, letting the water heal us.
One more question or comment? At least in the group, some people may hang around and chat around the fire after if you want to. Still have food to finish there. I have one question then. So, you know, thank you so much for your talk. And I wish we could have gone on another hour. I did really want to hear more. So, you know, I've been fortunate enough to grow up and to live now in Indigenous culture, not my culture, because I'm not from here, but I've been very welcomed by Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities here. And I'm very grateful for that myself and my children who've grown up learning a lot of Anishinaabe teachings and ceremonies and language. And I've had the privilege to be doctored by many different healers because Toronto has a very strong Indigenous community with a lot of resources around spirituality and traditional healing practices through organizations. You know, so through those here and elsewhere in Alberta, when I was younger, I've had much doctoring done to me and to my family members, you know, extractions, different types in different ways, similar to what you've talked about. And I understand those doctoring experiences to be both spiritual and physical, you know, where I've seen things removed from people's bodies physically, like big things and small things with no incision, and then them to be, or me or them to be healed from the cancer, the tumor, the whatever's wrong gets better immediately from that. So it's physical and spiritual. I forget what I was gonna ask. Oh, how? So there's a lot of evidence from our own experience and our own knowledges and our own communities to show that these traditional healing practices work, but they're not objective and procedural necessarily the way that Western science evidences knowledge and healing, because there's a spiritual and physical element, right? Because sometimes spirit can say, no, you can't, this is your path and you have to do this. We don't, that there's there's a holistic way of understanding that. It's not just the physical removing of toxic items from people, or the changing of the mind, through reprogramming and teaching. There's many elements to make that. And part of that includes social and moral codes and principles. And one of the great challenges that we currently face in today's world is around drug and alcohol addiction for our people. It's taking our people's lives at record rates right now, especially with drugs. Alcohol always, many people I know, especially since there's been a surge of money coming to people, dying of alcoholism, dying of drugs because they suddenly got $20,000, and that's a lot of alcohol and substances, and then they're gone because we've all seen that since reconciliation happened. And actually, in my view, the project of Canadian reconciliation is actually not to actually reconcile and help us heal, is actually to kill us off faster. That's my own personal view. I could talk about that some other time, another place. Maybe I could do a webinar on that. If anyone wants to hear what I think. But on that idea of understanding that alcohol and substances are a huge threat to our well-being and survival right now, how can traditional knowledges with its cultural values and protocols and principles be used to address that? Because there's what we've called in our research over the last 10 years a culture clash, as there's often values and principles around abstinence in traditional healing settings, ceremonies, people. And so that kind of in a way actually makes traditional healing inaccessible to people sometimes who have substance use issues or alcohol issues, but who desperately need to have access to these. How has that been addressed in your work? Because we still haven't addressed it in Toronto. That's like a big ticket item in the healing world, I would say, based on the research we've been doing over the last 18 years with different organizations in Toronto. How do you guys address that?
Well, first off, the harnessing of traditional practices and ceremonies for intervening in addiction, some of the longest health medical effort in the States. In the wake of that 1975 Self-Determination Act, different tribal communities were authorized to take federal dollars and run the program. What we're doing that since then. They started really with substance treatment programs, took those over, immediately started cleaning up stops. Other kinds of approaches. So it's been established for quite a while that fixing those things is integrating, incorporating for their purposes is what people are interested in. How to navigate something like that prohibition from engaging in substance use adjacent to ceremonial practice. That is something that different people have different understandings traditionally, how long we're supposed to do from those things, etc. What it means, whether you're turned away or not. And so this is an instance where I think adaptation is interesting to sort of track. Because in the work I did on Blackfeet, for example, the traditional leaders there, what was known as the Crazy Dog Society, were already interested in like relaxing some of the older traditional strictures around ceremony persuasion. One was, for example, the menstruation tag, which is very common across ceremony participation throughout Native North America. They were, he and his brother were some leaders of the society, they felt like that was one that probably could be set aside. We were talking the other night about when women started to be able to drum. My family had a drum as a drum, where on the Northern Plains, I didn't know this, but I read about it in an article by an ethnomusicologist who said that our family drum was one of the first to have women starting to sing in the seventies in ways that weren't really done traditionally before. So adaptation is sort of what we do, and I think, you know, tracing, charted, and mapping, that's different than advocating. But so one question is, you know, depending on where we see ourselves, it's good for my own freedom, I can have an opinion. For other communities, it's not my business to have an opinion necessarily, unless I ask, and I'm happy to share, but that's not mine to say. So, you know, that's why you hear me sometimes say it's about locally, it's about collaborations and partnerships, it's about helping and facilitating, and don't underestimate the importance of resourcing and facilitating these kinds of processes. It's a big part of what I think our job can be as academics. It's making knowledge, of course, but in terms of community processes, it's about providing resources to give them time to step back from it all. The crisis mode that we are in, of course, being with limited resources, how can we allow people to have a moment to step back and think through these issues, come up with solutions? And that's not trivial. And actually we can write about that.
Mr. Cho, Jimmy Witch. Last one quick, because then we have to close.
Absolutely, yeah. So I heard you mentioned like elements of self-determination and autonomy in service provision. And I just wanted to comment, I think that you answered my question that I asked earlier and answered Etsy's question as well. There's still so much paternalism in this country. And, you know, if it's not Canada, it's the province. If it's not the province, then, you know, it's some third party organization or institution, you know, but
They
there's
can't run a power cord.
exactly, yeah. So there's always like, you know, and despite the fact that we have, you know, we've adopted UNDRIP and we have the rights, you know, and all of this, there's still, it's the culture that's not shipped. So yeah, it's a culture clash, but the culture needs to change. We need to have that autonomy and that self-determination to be able to do these practices in community. And I've just not seen that yet. And it's something we all talk about, you know, we need that. That's the goal.
Whoop.
Yeah.
Clayton?
Good. Was good?
Thanks, Clayton.
No, I'm good.
All right. Have food. Visit. Talk to Dr. Don, talk to Clay, talk to our elder Sue, talk to anyone. Thank you for coming, everybody.